Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, friends, and colleagues. Welcome to the National Museum of the United States Army. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. John Moss, who is an educator with the National Museum, and he will be your host this evening. I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And welcome to our other Elizabeth tonight, Dr. Elizabeth Varon, Liz also from the University of Virginia. Good evening, folks, to those of you who are tuned in, so to speak. Glad to have you. We're very excited about tonight's program, but we are also very appreciative of folks coming to us this evening for the second night of our Civil War Week at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir. So let me reiterate that if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function down toward the bottom of your screen, and we're going to allow some time at the end of the program to get to some of the questions. Utilize the chat and just enjoy the program. So we'll get started here. Welcome, Elizabeth Varon. A very, very good evening to you.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here. And I thank everyone who is joining us here on this beautiful spring evening. Your attendance is much appreciated. And I imagine you all are very excited, as I am, about the National Museum of the United States Army and eager to visit it when we're all allowed to do such things again. So welcome. I look forward to a great conversation.
Thank you very much for being here. All right, folks, let me introduce Liz Varon here. She is Langbourne M. Williams Professor of American History at the University of Virginia and serves on the Executive Council of the John L. Now III Center for Civil War History. She received her PhD from Yale University and has held teaching positions at Wellesley College and Temple University. A specialist in the Civil War era and 19th century South, Varon is the author of We Mean to Be Counted, White Women and Politics in Antebellum Virginia. That came out in 1998. Southern Lady Yankee Spy, The True Story of Elizabeth Van Lew, a Union Agent in the Heart of the Confederacy, which came out in 2003. Disunion, The Coming of the American Civil War, 1789 to 1859, 2008, one of my favorite Civil War books. And Appomattox, Victory, Defeat, and Freedom at the End of the Civil War, 2013. Southern Lady Yankee Spy won 3 book awards and was named one of the 5 best books on the Civil War away from the battlefield in the Wall Street Journal. Appomattox won the 2014 Library of Virginia Literary Award for nonfiction, the 2014 Dan and Marilyn Laney Prize for Civil War History, of the Austin Civil War Roundtable, and the 2014 Eugene Fate Award in Civil War Studies of the New York Military Affairs Symposium. It was also named one of Civil War Monitor's best books of 2014 and one of National Public Radio's 6 Civil War books to read now. Her new book, Armies of Deliverance, A New History of the Civil War, appeared with Oxford University Press in March 2019 and was reviewed very favorably by the New York Times, Washington Post, The Nation, and the Wall Street Journal. So again, welcome, Elizabeth, and we're all really looking forward to hearing about General Grant. And I thought what I would do is start out with just a basic question that you and I talked about a little bit a few weeks ago, but what is it about Grant that attracts you and me and many other scholars, many pretty recently, readers, etc., to his story, and what is it about Grant that has guided your work on him?
Well, that's a great place to start, John, and I'm delighted to talk about Grant. He's an endlessly fascinating figure, and we can start by pointing to some qualities that historians have heralded as key Grant characteristics: his tenacity and determination, his humility, his personal decency, a sort of clear-eyed sense of right and wrong. Of course, we're interested in his strategic and tactical risk-taking and bravado. He has some Lincolnian qualities, a willingness to learn and to change and adapt. Historians often comment on Grant's calmness under fire. Here's a man who was not a whiner, not one to panic. As a number of historians have commented, he seemed to be at his best when things were going poorly, to be able to see his way out of a jam. These are all important characteristics that draw me and other scholars. And his talents, of course, as a writer, and we'll come to that as I'm sure we'll talk about his very important memoir. Personally, I've had a kind of long relationship as a scholar with Grant. I've never written a biography of him, but he has featured really prominently in my work, including in my book on the Union spy, Elizabeth Van Lew, a Union spy based in Richmond, operating an underground Union espionage operation there that funneled information to Grant, crucial information during the Richmond-Petersburg campaign to Grant and his high command at City Point. And Van Lew, this remarkable female spy, was a huge devotee of Grant's, a huge fan of his. They developed a friendship. And as one of his first acts as president, when he's elected president in 1868 and then takes office in 1869, he appoints Van Lew to a very prominent patronage position as postmaster of Richmond, and a fascinating story ensues. Happy to answer questions about that down the line. But I was encountering Grant, in a sense, in that book as a patron, as Van Lew's patron, and as the person whose sort of Richmond campaign inspired her and was the source of some of her own major contributions. Grant is, of course, absolutely central to my book on Appomattox, on Lee's surrender. And there I really compare and contrast Lee and Grant. And the purpose of that book, and that'll be a theme for us today, is sort of peeling back layers of myth to look at the complex realities behind those myths. So in the case of Appomattox, a very powerful myth that this meeting between Lee and Grant was a kind of meeting of the minds, a bearing of the hatchet, a gentleman's agreement that quickly sealed peace and reconciliation. And I make the argument in that book that Lee and Grant were really not on the same page, to put it mildly, that they were represented two very different visions of the peace, two very different political ideologies. And I had as a goal in that book to, in a sense, closely analyze Grant's lenient terms to Lee at Appomattox and to unravel what they meant, what Grant intended by them. He did not intend, as some Confederates imagined and contended, to exonerate them or to pardon them. He intended for this magnanimity to change hearts and minds, to effect a repentance and a compliance from them. And he was, in a sense, paroling these defeated Confederates, putting them on probation, giving them a kind of freedom that depended on their upholding the terms of their paroles and being good and compliant citizens. And in the course of writing that book, I came to learn a lot of things about Grant, about, again, his willingness to change and to embrace change, about his resentment of the Lee mystique and of the ways that Lee tried to explain the Union victory as a victory of overwhelming numbers and resources, of brute force. In Lee's eyes, the Union victory was a victory essentially of might over right. And Grant was absolutely committed to the idea that the Union victory was a victory of right over wrong, and committed to instructing defeated Southerners in a sort of new moral order and getting them to internalize that notion that this was a victory of right over wrong. In my recent book, Armies of Deliverance, in a sense, it's an interpretive synthesis of the entire war. Again, we'll talk about some of its themes too. But in that book, I'm really focused on, in a sense, the backstory to Grant's generous terms at Appomattox, this belief that Southerners could be delivered and redeemed for the Union, and that their loyalty could be regenerated. And in Armies of Deliverance, for me, the Grant that emerges, this will sound a little counterintuitive as a way to describe a famously fierce general, But in that book, what emerges for me is a Grant as a harmonizer, someone who was successful at reconciling some Union goals that were in tension, reconciling hard war tactics that targeted the Confederate infrastructure with lenient peace terms, reconciling a raiding strategy that became so important to the Union, particularly in the last 2 years of the war, with the need to remember that Lee's army itself had to be the ultimate focus in the destruction of that army, an ability to reconcile Lincoln's two signature policies of emancipation, but then of amnesty to repentant Confederates. And in a sense, an ability, Grant the harmonizer, showed an ability to sort of reconcile, harmonize continuity and change. Grant wanted the Union to be whole again above all else, but he also wanted the Union to change, wanted the South to change, to become better. And fundamentally, his message to Confederates at Appomattox was, we don't want to punish you, we want you to change. And it was very disconcerting and disappointing to him when the reaction of ex-Confederates was to contend that the demand for change was a form of punishment, and that they would see it that way, and that the no easy peace would unfold. So there's so many elements to his story, both as a public figure and also as a private man. Here was a very devoted husband and father, and a man who, despite his reputation as a sort of stern, stolid public figure, was a very warm human being for those in his inner circle. Again, so many things to like, but also to analyze.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit about what you mean. You just started to go into a little bit, but this meaning that you have in your title of your book, what do you mean when you talk about deliverance, and how does that tie in with Grant? How do you use that term?
So, I wrote this book, Armies of Deliverance, again, a sort of synthesis of the Civil War with a focus on Union war aims and Union motivations. I'm by training principally a historian of the South, and I'd written about and thought a lot about the South and the Confederacy. So I've had a bit of a learning curve, really truly understanding and immersing myself in the Union war effort. And I, certainly had done some of that work with Van Lew and Appomattox, but I wanted it to have a sort of deeper dive into Northern war aims and motivations. And I argue in this book that the Union believed that Northern men marched off to war believing in 1861 that their purpose was to deliver the Southern masses from their thraldom to an elite secessionist conspiracy. They believed that those Southern masses, the majority of whom were non-slaveholders, had been demagogued and pressured and coerced and duped into supporting the Confederacy, and that if only the spell of secession could be broken and those secessionists discredited, that a latent unionism might assert itself. It's not surprising that Northerners would think this on the eve of the war. This was part of a general hope for a quick, and decisive victory. What surprised me as I researched this book and read a lot of letters and diaries by Union soldiers and memoirs by commanders like Grant and Sherman and so on, was that this belief that the Southern masses could be disenthralled, that the purpose of the war was deliverance, proved very resilient, and it's essentially carries right through to Grant's terms at Appomattox again, which were intended to change hearts and minds. And so the way to maybe sum this up is to say Grant was preoccupied, as Lincoln was, as so many Union soldiers and leaders were, with this problem of regenerating loyalty. What they wanted was a Union that was whole again. They all subscribed to what scholars have called the affective theory of the Union, as in affection, the idea that the bonds of union had to be bonds of mutual affection and respect, that the Union couldn't survive on coercion, that those bonds had to be somehow restored. So I was interested to see Grant in letters to his wife Julia and in other documents early in the war say, in effect, that he felt that if the Southern people could express their unbiased feelings, untrammeled by their leaders, as he put it in a June 1862 letter to Julia, that the war could be ended very, very quickly, that they would renounce those leaders. I was even more surprised to see Grant still arguing in 1863 and 1864 that while the Union Army had to send a clear message that it was prepared to annihilate the Confederate Army if necessary, it also had to send the message that for those willing to pledge their loyalty, they would receive in return the protection of the Union Army and of the laws of the United States government. So in a sense, Grant and others cling to this idea. This sort of boils down to this: a message to the Confederates that the choice was theirs, that disloyalty would bring a very high price of destruction of their society, but that a return to loyalty would bring protection and peace. So we see again a sort of resilience of that idea. Secondly, and perhaps even more important, in my book, Deliverance connotes also the liberation of the enslaved, and the way this becomes a central Union war aim. And the liberation of the enslaved was a goal to which Grant became more and more committed over the course of the war. Again, a journey not unlike Lincoln's, a real embrace of emancipation as a military necessity. And what interested me and surprised me there is that we have tended to, as we've told the story of emancipation, emphasize the ways that Lincoln sold emancipation as a policy to a skeptical Northern public by emphasizing its punitive nature. Here's a way to punish the Confederates by removing resources, undermining their economy. What I was, again, surprised to find was the degree to which Unionists, Lincoln and Grant and others, described and imagined and defended emancipation as a measure that would have broad benefits for the whole country, including and perhaps especially for Southern whites, not just punitive, but a sort of idealistic argument on behalf of emancipation, that since slavery was the root cause of the troubles, once that was removed out of the way, you could have real reunion and the South could be opened up to progress of the kind that Northerners had seen in the North and about which they were very, very proud. So Deliverance connotes the deliverance of the slaves, but also regenerating the loyalty of white Southerners, and Grant remained, very committed to both of those goals.
Getting back to Grant as a military commander, or even as president, but maybe we'll stick with military at this point. What have you found to be the most interesting aspect about Grant, particularly regarding his leadership style?
Well, it's a bit of a truism, often repeated, that Grant was not an enthusiastic student of military theory and textbooks. He was a guy who thought the battlefield itself was the best teacher of warfare. He said famously, paraphrasing, that his military philosophy was find out where the enemy is, get at him, and strike as hard as you can. Pretty simple maxim. But to get into Grant's psychology, we should recognize a few things. First of all, and here I'm quoting a terrific military history textbook I use for my students in my military history class at UVA, which I'm teaching this semester, that has observed that essentially there are kind of two sorts of generals who emphasize their own difficulties and their opponents' opportunities on the one hand, i.e. McClellan. And then there are generals who emphasize their own opportunities and their opponents' problems. They stay focused on what they can do rather than being too unnerved or distracted by what the enemy might do. Grant is definitely in the second category. He was very focused on his own opportunities. Now this, sometimes proved disadvantageous when he was caught off guard or hadn't fully anticipated what the enemy might do. Shiloh or Cold Harbor or the Crater are examples. But generally, on balance, this focus on seizing opportunities served Grant very well. And so he, I mentioned he sort of harmonized hard war goals with this belief in the need to regenerate loyalty. Grant sees, certainly by the end of 1862, that a limited war confined to the battlefield isn't going to bring the Confederates to heel, and that a broader strategy attacking the Confederate infrastructure is necessary. This is the famous raiding strategy, army-sized raids to target Confederate assets. And the key thing there is target, as the historian Mark Grimsley and others have argued. This Union strategy of raiding was not an exercise in wanton destruction, but instead in targeted severity, with certain assets being the focus. So targeting what? The plantation system itself, and assets like cotton crops, targeting bridges and Confederate factories and military assets and railroad lines and so on. The purpose was to undermine the Confederate capacity to wage war. And this raiding strategy had a lot of logistical advantages. It enabled the Union to, sort of sidestep, in certain cases, having to occupy and garrison a territory and use troops to do that if they're raiding and moving on to new targets. But it also had a psychological impact and this was very much the purpose of Sherman's tactics, as well as Grant's and Sheridan's, and particularly again in the last year or two of the war. The purpose of it was to undermine the morale of the Southern people by showing them that their own army could not protect them and their resources from this kind of strategy. The flip side of this is that Grant is a former quartermaster in the Mexican War, himself paid careful attention to logistics for his own army. So he was focused not only on denying access of the enemy to factories and railroads and ordnance and so on, but also understood the importance of making sure his own army was well supplied with these things. And so we see, for example, in his Petersburg campaign, he's targeting Confederate railroads and supply lines while the Union is building up this amazing network of railroads and resources at City Point, Grant's Virginia headquarters. So those are a few themes among many. As I said, and as historians have also noted, Grant understood the need to focus on Lee's army, to destroy Lee's army. He understood the need to keep Richmond in his sights. The historian Brooks Simpson has put this nicely, saying that Grant understood the symbolic importance of Richmond, and that one way to get at Lee was to get at Richmond, the defense of which was so important for Confederate morale. His creativity in the Vicksburg campaign, his sort of ability to see the whole chessboard in the last year of the war, understanding the need for simultaneous coordinated campaigns in Atlanta, in the Shenandoah Valley, in the Richmond Theater, and so on. All of these are signs of military genius, and they are also, reminders that we shouldn't underrate, as people have at times done, Grant's strategic and tactical genius, and we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking the Union's overwhelming numbers and resources won the day. You needed a man who knew how to use them effectively, and that, of course, was Grant. Sure,
great. We talked a little bit before about the interest of biographers on Grant, and of all the recent biographies of Grant, the ones that come to mind go back to the 80s with McFeely, the Brands, Chernow, Smith, White, Waugh. Not that I want anybody to read any books besides yours, but if they had to choose a biography on Grant, which one do you like the best?
Well, like you said, there's been a real flowering of work on Grant in the past 20 years or so. I have a clear favorite, and that is Joan Waugh's biography of Grant. It's just a superb book. It's very well written. It's a beautifully balanced book. It integrates Grant's military career that she provides an overview of with his presidency, which has often been sort of overlooked and misunderstood. It illuminates his own personality, but also his public image and his legacy and his memory. It's one of these books that's perfectly pitched to appeal to general readers, a very compelling narrative, but also to have new insights for scholarly experts as well. And her focus really influenced my own Appomattox biography in the sense that she emphasizes that the core belief for Grant is the rejection of a false equivalence between the Union and the Confederacy. To him, reconciliation had to be founded on Southern acceptance of the Union's terms, which were sectional harmony, a restoration of the Union, and a guarantee of freedom and emancipation. That is, Grant sought to occupy the moral high ground and believed that only the Union should occupy the moral high ground. A way another scholar has put it is to say there was a lost cause creed of Lee and his ilk that romanticized the Confederacy. There was also a one cause creed that emphasized the righteousness and skill and bravery of the Union side, and Grant was absolutely essential in elaborating that one cause creed and then in defending it. So I think that I highly recommend that book to everyone. It's also beautifully illustrated, and again, a great read. John, I think you may be muted now. You need to unmute.
I'm trying to get to my questions list, and let's talk a little bit more about his relationship with and view of the two presidents that he worked with, served under during the War and Reconstruction. Obviously Lincoln, but Andrew Johnson as well. What did Grant have to say about those two presidents?
Another great question. Grant's relationship with Lincoln was a strong relationship. Best treatment of this is by a historian named Brooks Simpson, who's made the case that it wasn't always easy. They weren't always on the same page, but it really blossomed into a friendship. The two men did agree on policy matters, again, a commitment to emancipation, a commitment to Black enlistment in the Union Army, and a recognition of how important and decisive that was, a commitment to Lincoln's amnesty policy as promulgated during the war, and then as it informed the Appomattox terms. Grant had to work to cultivate a relationship with Lincoln. There's a sort of people imagine that Lincoln, or sometimes will claim that he wasn't a micromanager, and that was one of his great strengths as a commander-in-chief. But in fact, he did exercise quite a bit of oversight of his generals and sometimes meddle. And Grant was very, very good at discouraging that, in a sense of getting Lincoln to trust him. In part, Grant did this by not criticizing Lincoln, unlike McClellan, for example, who said all kinds of terrible things about Lincoln to his face and behind his back. As Simpson notes, again, the two men weren't always on the same page, particularly on the issue of political generals, men who had not been to West Point and who were not trained professionals, but who had been appointed because it would please some political constituency or another. Nathaniel Banks in Louisiana, Benjamin Butler were examples. So there was some difference of opinion there, but Grant ultimately believed very strongly in the subordination of military to civil rule, and he took his political cues from Lincoln. Lincoln was his president, and he followed Lincoln's lead politically, and again, a true friendship emerged. And in general, as we think about Union victory, and historians emphasize this a great deal, ultimately, particularly in the final year, it's that command harmony between Lincoln and Grant and Sherman and Sheridan, all on the same page about the need for this exhaustion strategy, this targeted severity. And that's key to victory. With regards to Johnson, of course, we have a very different story. Grant tries to work with Johnson, Lincoln's successor, but very quickly becomes utterly exasperated by Johnson's volatility, by his lack of personal discipline, by his excessive leniency. Johnson, in a sense, illustrates that there were limits to Grant's and Lincoln's vision of leniency, and Johnson crossed those limits by pardoning thousands of ex-Confederates, including former leaders of the Confederacy, and permitting ex-Confederates to regain their political rights and their political power during Johnson's presidency. All of this, Grant was horrified to see endangered emancipation. So as deeply invested as he was in the idea that his leniency would change Southern hearts and minds, as commander after the war, he kept getting evidence, sort of heartbreaking evidence from men in the field in the South, explaining that there was widespread anti-Black violence by ex-Confederates and efforts to roll back emancipation and Black freedom. So Grant becomes discouraged by all this, as the Republican Congress does. Grant, essentially by this point, a moderate Republican, as the majority of Congress was, but he's eventually, in a sense, drifts towards the radical Republican camp, in part because of disgust with Johnson. He goes with Johnson on part of Johnson's infamous swing round the circle of political campaigning. He sees Johnson sort of sputter, make all kinds of wild accusations against his enemies, and behave in a very unpresidential fashion. And again, sort of empower and embolden, as they often said at the time, embolden the ex-Confederates to think they could have their way and their power again. And so Grant eventually splits from Johnson, and the Army is a major political football during Johnson's presidency and during Johnson's impeachment. Congress clashes with Johnson. It institutes its own program of Reconstruction with the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, but still the Army is needed to enforce that congressional program. Johnson stands in its way with his vetoes and other measures, and Grant splits with him and waits in the wings as the potential replacement in 1868, and is indeed elected president in Johnson's wake.
Okay. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to move to Appomattox, where we've got several questions already on Appomattox. So I want to try to maybe combine a few here if I could.
Sure, of course.
Can you talk through Grant and his role at Appomattox, his influence on the surrender, and his impression of General Lee as either a military leader or Confederate leader? I think a lot of folks would be very interested in hearing about Grant and Appomattox.
Yeah, absolutely. So Grant, again, understood that his role as general was to effect the surrender of Confederate troops. The political decisions about what the rights and prospects of those surrendered troops were going to be would ultimately be left to the civil authorities, to Lincoln and Congress. But Grant believed he had a clear mandate that he had been given by Lincoln, very clearly, to offer, this will sound a little paradoxical, this is how I put it in my book, to offer liberal terms of unconditional surrender. And what I mean by that is that the conditions were non-negotiable. In Grant's mind and in Lincoln's mind, this war was only going to end if the Confederates agreed to the reestablishment of national authority over the South re-entering the Union, and the Confederacy being dismantled and repudiated, and also the abandonment of slavery. Those were the terms, and no other terms were acceptable. At the same time, the liberal terms, again, Grant's message essentially: go home on your word, your parole, your promise that you will not take up arms against the United States government. Again, very lenient terms. Now, many Confederates, including Lee, feared that wouldn't be the case. There have been so many examples in human history of terms that were harsh or vindictive. But that's not, that's not the choice that Grant made, in part because essentially the purpose of the war was to restore the Union, to get those Southerners back into the fold. As I just describe it in Armies of Deliverance, Unionists like Grant sort of metaphorically described Confederates as errant brethren, as prodigal sons, as drunkards who needed to sober up, as pupils who needed to be taught, as heathens who needed to see the light. There was this again deep investment in regenerating loyalty. Now, for Grant, the key word of the surrender is vindication. He believes that the surrender vindicates him, vindicates the Union cause, vindicates a free labor system in which people are paid for their work, vindicates majority rule and democracy, vindicates the ideas that a citizen soldier army can outfight what he sees as the dupes and conscripts of the Confederacy. He believes it's a vindication in that it is demystifying Lee. He's aware that Lee had an almost sort of mystical reputation even among Northerners as the unbeatable man. Grant knew all along that Lee was beatable, and he reveled in this victory. Grant was hoping Lee would use his own influence to promote true repentance and reconciliation. Grant was very disappointed when Lee did not use his influence in this way. My next project is a biography of the Confederate General James Longstreet, who behaved in the way Grant was hoping Lee would behave. That is to say, Longstreet's essential position that emerges is, you all have won. A victory for your army is a victory for your ideas. We must now yield. Longstreet will embrace the Republican Party and its Reconstruction agenda, and a very, needless to say, very unusual move for a Confederate general. Longstreet will pay for that choice by becoming a pariah among ex-Confederates, but Grant was hoping for more Longstreets among the defeated Southerners, and I think again it's in terms of Grant's view of Lee. He recognized obviously that Lee was a very skilled general, and that Southerners had fought very tenaciously and bravely, but he also believed their cause, as he put it, was one of the worst that mankind had ever seen, and he really resented the idea that the Union victory was one of overwhelming numbers and resources. Lee says this in his famous farewell address to his troops, and I argue that in saying this literally on the Appomattox battlefield, Lee is making a political statement. He's saying that the Northern victory was, in some fundamental sense, illegitimate. Again, not a victory of skill and bravery, but a victory of brute force. And Grant rejected this, out of hand, and really resented it. And we can see that, throughout Grant's career, including in his memoir, and the way he tells the story of the war there.
Mm-hmm. Let me get back to the leadership aspect again, because one of our audience members has a very interesting point and question. As we've already talked about, at the earliest opportunity, he basically got rid of Rosecrans, McClernand, Benjamin Butler, none of whom some were Democrats or former Democrats. Others did not have West Point experience, although Rosecrans did. But one of the more interesting relationships, as David, one of our audience members, brings up, is Grant's antipathy to George Thomas. And when Grant was, both when he was in the Western Theater through Chattanooga, when he came east, he still was very close to sacking Thomas before the Battle of Nashville, if I remember that correctly. So what was the difficult relationship between Grant and Thomas all about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thomas is a fascinating figure, and he is representative of um, a very key group in my Armies of Deliverance book, and a key group for understanding the war generally, and that is white Southern Unionists. So Thomas, a Virginian, who, when faced with the same choice that Lee and others were faced with, whether to resign a commission in the Federal Army and fight for the Confederacy or not, chose the Union. Not the only such general, but perhaps other than Winfield Scott, the most famous such example. Thomas, along with a small number of prominent Southern politicians, Breckinridge of Kentucky, Cassius Clay, Hamilton of Texas, Gant of Arkansas, and so on, were held up as proof that Southerners, could be part of this Unionist coalition, and to represent the hope that more Southerners might become part of the coalition. So Thomas is a key figure. Obviously, plays a critical role at Chattanooga, and performs very well alongside Sherman and Hooker and other other key commanders. Grant's own personal relationship with Thomas, I don't know much about it. I don't know. I mean, I know that of the tensions, and in a sense, I guess what I'm saying, without knowing much about the roots of the problems, it's all the more surprising, given what an important symbol Thomas was of Southern Unionism, that he and Grant didn't get along. A number of people have noted in connection with this theme that Grant could hold a grudge. He could be overly loyal to his friends and stubbornly unforgiving to people who he decided were enemies for one reason or another. This was, the holding of grudges was not an unusual characteristic for many of these leading generals. They had their favorites and their folks about whom they were sort of implacably suspicious, so the question is a good reminder that the best, most compelling portrait of any of these men is a portrait that makes room for their flaws and shortcomings and short-sightedness, and Grant's stubborn feuds with some of the men you named is an example of just that.
Let me again go back to Appomattox. The portrait of that scene is of reconciliation and respect for each other's armies. Grant kind of tamped down the cheering after the surrender from his own troops and gave rations. And most people are familiar with the general terms of the surrender being hardly punitive.
Right.
And yet his friend that you mentioned, William T. Sherman, he had an altogether different experience in Durham when he was dealing with the surrender of Joe Johnson. What was the difference there? Was Sherman being too gracious or too generous in his terms?
Yeah, that's a great point. So Sherman offers his own lenient terms to Joe Johnston, and they are deemed to have gone too far, and Grant is essentially sent to the scene to bring him in line with the Appomattox terms. The line Sherman had crossed was seeming to restore the political rights and offer political exoneration and the restoration of property rights to those troops, and that went beyond the brief of these military commanders. Again, Grant said, go home on the promise you won't wage war again, but he didn't speak to the issue of whether their political rights and voice and property rights, aside from slave owning, would be restored. Whereas Sherman did seem to encroach on that territory that was the business of Congress and of the president and of the civil authorities. So that's really the principal difference. Grant, the military men were supposed to attend to the surrender of men at arms, not to resolve these political questions. Now, having said that, Grant, clearly hoped that his Appomattox terms, which were in the spirit of Lincoln's amnesty policy, would affect a speedy reconciliation, and that Congress and the president would make decisions that reflected this idea of the victor whose victory was total, extending gracious terms to the defeated in the hope that that would change hearts and minds and affect a true repentance and loyalty. That's clearly what Grant was hoping for. And I've mentioned it a few times in passing, and should just note that we talk a lot as we should about emancipation as a signature policy of Lincoln's, but his December amnesty proclamation, which I write a great deal about in my Armies of Deliverance, was another signature policy, and in essence the promise that those who took an oath of future loyalty and promised to obey the laws of the land, including the Emancipation Proclamation and congressional measures and so on, that amnesty proclamation was, or 10% plan as it's sometimes called, because Lincoln hoped that once 10% of the electorate of a given state had made this pledge of future loyalty, that 10% could be a vanguard that led that state back into the Union. That policy was key to Lincoln's thinking and to Grant's thinking, and they both hoped. I mean, Lincoln hoped to a degree that will really surprise people, that this amnesty policy might affect, desertion from the Confederate ranks. Union soldiers took copies of the amnesty policy and into Southern communities and distributed it, hoping it would really, resonate. The Confederates rejected it overwhelmingly, but this was a key hope.
Another audience question is related to the election of 1864, and to what extent did the victories that Grant had won, although tough sledding from Wilderness to Petersburg, but Sherman capturing Atlanta, the March to the Sea, to what effect do you think those victories of the North led to Lincoln's reelection? Because there was a point in time in the late summer and even into the early fall where Lincoln, tell me, I believe he didn't think he was going to get.
Yeah, I mean, Lincoln's reelection is by no means a foregone conclusion. He did worry and say so in August that he was afraid he would lose the election, that if he lost the election, the man who won, McClellan, would essentially, fritter away all of the hard won sacrifices and gains that Union troops had made. Some people said to Lincoln, well, we're in the middle of a civil war, maybe this isn't a good time to have an election. But Lincoln, of course, said, and again, I sort of paraphrase, if we don't have an election, they've won. This is a war about majority rule. And so we're going to have an election, whatever the risks. Very clearly, Union victories, Sherman's that you mentioned, fall of Atlanta, were key. I'll add to your list Sheridan's success in the Shenandoah Valley and his campaign to sort of target Confederate resources there to remove another area from which Lee and his men in the Richmond-Petersburg trenches might be resupplied, was also absolutely key, in part because the Shenandoah Valley, there'd always been a fear that the Confederates might emerge from the valley and attack Washington, D.C. And so that's also key. So it's a combination of the Union victories and political messaging. The Democrats' message was that the war had been a failure, that Lincoln was a failed commander-in-chief, that Grant was a butcher who had sent men to their deaths with no effect and no decisive victories to show for it. The Republican message was that the Democrats were essentially, and here they really focused on the Copperhead Democrats, the most virulently racist anti-Lincoln Democrats, spoke as though they would be willing, perhaps, to concede Confederate independence in order to have a negotiated peace. Grant, by the way, hated the Copperheads. I think he may have hated them more than he hated Confederates. He just felt that it was inexcusable that these sort of stay-at-home traitors, as he saw it, would make these kinds of arguments. So the importance of those victories that your questioner asked about is that it completely invalidated this argument that the war had been a failure, that the Union Army was a failure. And of course, the remarkable thing scholars have noted is that Union soldiers in the field who were voting essentially about whether to continue a war that might send them to their deaths, voted for Lincoln in the majority, and voted to take those next steps, whatever necessary, whatever the risk.
Mm-hmm. All right, we have time for a couple more here. I'll combine two of them. There were two notable, I don't want to say blunders as judgmental, but there were two militarily difficult tragedies in the Overland Campaign and into Petersburg. One being the attacks of the Union Army against Lee's entrenched positions at Cold Harbor, and also how the attack at the crater was handled, because of his veto of Burnside's plans to use African-American troops who were rookies to go into the crater and attack. And Grant had some thoughts about that. Can you elaborate on how he felt about Cold Harbor and why he made the decision that he did just before the attack at the crater?
Yeah, I mean, these are two examples of Grant, overestimating his own men and underestimating his foe. He was, saw both as terrible disasters. Didn't shrink from the idea that that's what they were. That they were, poor decisions. He didn't attempt to spin or vindicate them as, defeats were very often spun by generals on both sides and by the press corps and politicians. But these were two unspinnable defeats. I mean, as you said, at the crater, some sort of last minute decisions to send some white troops in the forward initially, who had not been trained and prepared for this mission, and who did run into the crater instead of around it, and who were trapped. Then black troops came in to try to rescue them, and they were trapped, and it was an utter disaster. Cold Harbor comes at the end of this brutal overland campaign in which the two armies are engaged in this sort of constant bloodletting, and in which Grant had tried to outflank Lee to get in between him and Richmond, and Lee had essentially anticipated most of Grant's moves, and here was a case of just that. And again, the tragedy of something like Cold Harbor, as historians have noted, is that the men who fought that battle, who made those charges there, were under no illusions that this was a good plan, in a scene that sort of foretold World War I and going over the top in those trenches. Men, wrote their names in ranks on pieces of paper and pinned them to their shirts, because it was clear that this was going to be a very bloody, very bloody offensive. Again, in general, we think of Grant as fighting a war of attrition, but he wanted, purposeful and effective use of that superior manpower, and he saw, those two battles for the tragedy that they were.
Well, I usually end by asking our guests what they're working on, but you've already spilled the beans on that one on your Longstreet book, so we look forward to that. But I will ask kind of a research question, which is, if a graduate student is interested in working on a topic with related to Grant, what are some of the areas that haven't really been covered that much that would be really worth having a master's or a doctoral student work on and to explore?
I think that there's so many topics, and the exciting thing about Civil War studies is that there's always something new to say, either because we discover new sources or we have new resources for using old sources, or a new frame in which to view a familiar source. I'm very interested and would urge students to look at Grant's relationship with USCT leaders and troops and his view of the USCT and his role in Black enlistment, his policies towards and view of contraband camps, his involvement in recruitment of African American soldiers and the controversies over their pay and training and so on. I think those are all very fruitful areas. We haven't talked at all about his presidency. I think his presidency still, there's much to say. Scholars have focused more on his military command history than on his presidency, but it too is fascinating. You know, again, somewhat cloaked in myth. For a long time, people have sort of remembered a failed presidency, charges of corruption of some of his cronies and so on, of economic depression, many things that proved challenging. But you know, Chernow and others recently have reminded us that Grant took a very courageous stand on behalf of Reconstruction, Black voting, the 15th Amendment, civil rights. He tried to infiltrate and take down the Klan through the Enforcement Acts. I think all of these topics are very worthwhile. And then finally, you know, as part of this renaissance of writing on Grant that you referred to, we are really more and more appreciating Grant the writer. This is one of the things I love about Joan Law's biography, is that she makes the point that although, you know, we might have been surprised that Grant there, as he's literally dying from his horrific throat cancer, writes this incredible book in the course of a year in which he's in agonizing pain, a book that historians and literary scholars agree is one of the great memoirs written by an American. We might be tempted to say, well, Grant the writer, where did that come from? But Grant, as he himself put it, had been, you know, telling the story of the Civil War, here I'm paraphrasing Law, for 25 years in the dispatches and commands that he wrote, and after action reports and speeches to his troops and so on as a commander. All of which he had done with a remarkable clarity. One of the things historians praise is the clarity of Grant's command orders to his subordinates, that they always knew exactly what they were supposed to do. This is really key. But he had also written his own speeches as president. He had a experience as a writer that he tapped in writing the memoir. And so to think of Grant as a literary figure and to look for the way the memoir echoes his earlier works. I mean, in a sense, I tried to take his famous correspondence with Lee and say, let's analyze this the way an English professor would. You know, what really can we glean? And so I think that too is a really interesting topic.
Great. Elizabeth Varon, author of Armies of Deliverance, professor of history at University of Virginia. Thank you from the National Museum of the U.S. Army for being here with us, and we appreciate your time, your expertise, your insights, and we were glad to have you.
Thank you so much. I look forward to visiting the museum as soon as I get a chance.
Great. Okay, I'd also like to thank all of our participants tonight who logged on and heard a very good program from Professor Varon. I just want to remind folks that tomorrow we continue again with programming in Civil War Week. 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, we will be having a virtual field trip with a Civil War soldier's load, which is an examination of the equipment and the clothing and the weapons that soldiers carried and wore during the Civil War. And then tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Eastern, we are going to welcome Chris Keller from the Army War College, who is going to speak on the close relationship between Generals Lee and Jackson during the Civil War. So again, thanks to everybody who participated and Professor Varon, and I wish everybody a good evening. Good night.
Thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it.